Antonio Gramsci is one of the most important intellectuals of the modern world. According to the philosopher Diego Fusaro, he is one of the 5 most cited Italian thinkers in reflective approaches. Journalist, writer, and founder of the Communist Party of Italy, Gramsci revolutionized the world of political struggle by studying like no one else the relationship between culture and established power that at that time was of a bourgeois nature. Despite not having the gifts of oratory to enervate the masses, he was a fervent promoter of worker organization in an Italy that was torn between the capitalism of the North and the peasantry of the South, while fascism emerged as an unstoppable force. Though he paid the ultimate price for his actions, his ideas live on. Partly because of his sharp intelligence, partly because of his stubborn perseverance, which did not give up even in jail. His revolution was a revolution of ideas, because he understood that to undermine or maintain established power, it was not only necessary to have an armed revolution in the style of Lenin, but above all, a progressive cultural dominance of the institutions that explain to us what is and how the world works. That is, building what we understand as a hegemony. Let's take a tour of the extraordinary life and ideas of Antonio Gramsci. This is Reynaldo Carrillo speaking. This is the New Encyclopedia, and I remind you that you can give us great support to continue doing this work, simply by leaving your comments, liking this video, and sharing the material with all your acquaintances. Below you can also find a link to the Patreon, where any collaboration is more than welcome. Without anything else to add, let's get started. Gramsci was born on January 22, 1891 in the town of Alès, on the island of Sardinia, which at that time had been part of the Kingdom of Italy for 30 years. He was the 4th child of Francesco Gramsci, who worked as a public official, and Giuseppina Marcias, who belonged to a small landowning family. Although the Gramscis were in the fragile strip of the middle class, the harsh conditions of the island forced them to move through various towns where 3 more children were born. Until Francesco settles in Guilarza, when young Antonio Gramsci was only 9 years old. Gramsci experienced poverty from a young age. Not surprisingly, he suffers from constant health problems, also associated with a severe fall that caused a noticeable malformation in his spine and stunted his growth. In a succession of misfortunes that foreshadowed his destiny, his father was arrested in the middle of 1898, just as Gramsci was starting primary school. He was found guilty of corruption and embezzlement, and after many months he was sentenced to almost 6 years in jail. Because of this, Antonio himself had to leave school at 11 years old and take on some temporary jobs. These are years of extreme difficulty, in which a child like Gramsci had to work up to 10 hours each day to receive 9 liras a month, equivalent to a kilogram of bread per day, for 1904. The father is released after serving his years of sentence, and with it he will return to work as an official, allowing Antonio to resume his education. Upon arriving at the Lyceum, he must move to the city of Cagliari. He was then 17 years old and shares a pension with his older brother Gennaro, who had just returned from military service in Turin. This was not a minor cohabitation, as his brother was already a socialist militant working in an ice factory. And this meant for Antonio a first approach to the working world and socialist ideas. There he approaches the work of the Italian historian Benedetto Croce, who would have a great influence on him. After finishing high school, Gramsci takes advantage of a very modest scholarship offered to him and begins studies at the University of Turin in modern philology. It is the first time that Gramsci moves to the north of Italy, already properly on the peninsula. Turin was one of the cities with the highest industrial growth in the entire kingdom, where capitalism was expanding. Different from southern Italy, where a scheme more similar to feudalism prevailed. Gramsci was able to witness these contrasts in ways of life and also perceive the dishonorable treatment that the Continentals gave to Italians from other regions. All of this was also set against the backdrop of a military confrontation between the Kingdom of Italy and the Ottoman Empire, which took place in what is now Libya. The war economy causes Gramsci to experience scarcity firsthand. He has no choice but to return to work to alleviate the difficulties, and all this leading to other problems for his already fragile state of health. As we previously mentioned, in Turin, Gramsci has some important encounters with the labor movement and socialist circles. He had references from Karl Marx through his brother, but it is here when he will delve deeper into Marx's work and that of the German philosopher. Is it him? This was a catalyst for Gramsci to join a local socialist group in a few months, and also for him in 1913 to do the same with the Italian Socialist Party, which at that time was the fastest-growing party organization in the Kingdom of Italy, established as the second political force for several elections. And in it lived a prominent northern military man named Benito Mussolini. During his time at university, Antonio Gramsci definitively adheres to Marxism, although he also approaches various topics of history and philosophy. In fact, it is here when he discovers the historicist current, of which he will be a great proponent in the future. But the bitter discontent he maintained due to his poor health and material well-being worsened the following year, when in the middle of 1914, what has since been called the First World War broke out. Italy declares its neutrality, but this does not exempt it from the supply problems that affected the entire European continent. That same year, Gramsci has the opportunity to start writing for the socialist weekly called The Cry of the People, in which he takes the opportunity to direct a critique at Mussolini. Just a few weeks after this, Mussolini will be expelled from the Socialist Party for his effusive opposition to Italy's neutrality in the World War. Among his serious financial problems, Gramsci decides in 1915 to leave the university just as Italy enters the war. In the midst of the conflict, the Kingdom of Italy sees the opportunity to control the northeast side of the Adriatic Sea. But to do so, it had to face the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was part of the Triple Alliance signed by Italy in the past. Despite diplomatic maneuvers and offers that attempted to prevent it, the confrontation arises when Italy denounces the Triple Alliance in May of 1915, to then join the Triple Entente and declare war on the Austro-Hungarians. From then on, and during those years of war, Gramsci will experience a period of active militancy with the workers and prolific writing in the weekly newspaper. Such was his talent with the pen that in 1916 he managed to join the Turin section of the newspaper Avanti, none other than the official press organ of the Italian Socialist Party. And here too he will leave a record of his uncompromising and ironic character, but also of his seasoned wit and idealistic upbringing. By 1917, he managed to rise to the party's steering committee in Turin, and in the heat of the events originating in Tsarist Russia, he became interested in the international course of socialism. The news of the revolution led by Lenin, Trotsky, and the Bolsheviks generated enormous fascination for him. With the war coming to an end in 1918, Gramsci devoted himself to airing his ideas, pamphlets, and his theatrical criticism in Avanti. By that year, he was fully committed to his mission, but still felt he wasn't serving to his full potential. Despite being short in stature, with a hump on his back and a narrow figure that wasn't very attractive. Nevertheless, he projected an aura of culture and wisdom, with his glasses and his hair slicked back. Soon after, his intellect was newly awakened, with the written work of Vladimir Lenin and towards 1919. Do you feel new demands for political activity? Inspired by the success of the Soviet experience? But the course that was emerging from Moscow was different from what the Socialist Party in Italy had been practicing. At the Congress of the Third International, the Soviet directive to the socialist parties of the world was revolution by arms, and therefore to distance from their ranks the leaders closest to reformism and the gradual conquest of power by electoral means. In the case of Italy, these directives were not heeded. Since the Socialist Party had positioned itself in the general elections of that year as the leading electoral force in the kingdom, despite the fact that they then did not have enough seats to lead the Council of Ministers. The discrepancy between the Italian socialists and the socialists from Moscow generates reservations in Antonio Gramsci, who identified more with the ideas of Vladimir Lenin. This resulted in a stealthy confrontation with the party leadership. In view of this, Gramsci decides to found a new magazine called The New Order, where he begins to shape the more communist orientation of his thought. It was a publication conceived as a weekly review of socialist culture, but from which he also issued criticisms against the Socialist Party, because he believed that it had mimicked the logic of power and bourgeois democracy, and that it no longer represented a real political alternative. The battle of ideas was Gramsci's own space, and from its pages he begins to promote the Soviets or workers' councils in Italy in the Soviet style, although he also goes into the factories to help organize them. His peak moment comes in 1920 in the midst of great labor unrest in Turin, where strikes and workers' councils become constant. And despite the fact that they ended up being repressed, Gramsci proves to be a frontline agitator with no reservations about disputing leadership. He was in his maturity stage and now showed himself as a more settled, judicious, idealistic, and critical man. Meanwhile, the landscape of the time was becoming more complex with the rise of the fascist movement, with Mussolini at the helm. The former member of the Socialist Party had created the famous Italian Combat Fascists in 1919, a political and paramilitary group committed to targeting socialists in cities in northern Italy, which earns them the favor of landowners and industrialists. Gramsci increasingly distances himself from the Socialist Party, and the last straw comes in the middle of the party congress in the city of Livorno, where Gramsci sees his chance of rising within its structures undermined. This leads him to officially separate, along with younger militants who were with him, and the result was the creation of the Communist Party of Italy. With Gramsci on the Central Committee, the party promptly joins the Third International nearly without delay. Gramsci himself runs for deputy in the May elections, although he does not manage to win the seat. The one who does manage to get elected is Benito Mussolini, who thus gains the definitive momentum to create his own political organization. By the end of that year, known as the National Fascist Party, emerged from the Italian Combat Fascists. Gramsci refocuses on his writings and publications. In the middle of 1922, he must leave Turin to represent the Communist Party within the Third International. His first international destination is Moscow, where he meets a young Russian violinist named Yulia Eshut, with whom he soon begins his first and only romantic relationship. While this is happening in Russia, the fate of Rome now lies in the hands of Benito Mussolini, who consolidates his conquest of power at the end of October. After several maneuvers, King Victor Emmanuel III appoints him as Prime Minister of the kingdom. In this way, the Duce begins a revolution with nationalist unionist features and a union between the workers and the industrialists. A revolution that would progressively advance in Italy over time. The advance of fascism was witnessed by Gramsci from afar while he was marrying Giulia in 1923. Also in that year, the onslaught of fascism against the Communist Party in Italy would begin when Mussolini ordered the arrest of thousands of its militants and of the Central Committee itself. Due to these events, Gramsci becomes the leading figure of the party in Italy, so he moves to Vienna in Austria to be closer to the events. He continues his journalistic activism and oversees the foundation of the new Italian newspaper L'Unità, which sought to fill the void left in the party's press after the imprisonments. Additionally, he runs again as a candidate for the 1924 elections, and although he now manages to be elected as a deputy, his victory is overshadowed by the overwhelming triumph of the fascist party. So he leaves the city of Vienna and his wife, who was already pregnant with their first child, to return to Rome. He is not exempt from threats and persecution, but he enjoyed parliamentary immunity and sought to win over the working masses while opposing Mussolini. A few months later, he returns to Moscow to reunite with his wife and meet his son Delio. But the repression against communist leaders in Italy intensifies while he is away. The government even seeks to outlaw parties from parliament, with a law aimed at banning Freemasonry and other organizations. And that was the only time Gramsci was able to confront Mussolini from his seat with a notable and hostile speech. A few months after this speech, the government finally outlaws the Communist Party, and its dwindling members go underground or into exile. In the extreme, the party's third Congress ends up being held outside of Italy in the French city of Lyon. At that Congress, Gramsci explains that fascism support should be seen as the result of an alliance between two classes, the AIC industrialists of the north and the agricultural landowners of the south. Therefore, he conceived that it was imperative to erode the bases that supported this alliance, winning over the northern proletariat and the southern peasantry. But with a good part of the militants outside of Italy, this seemed impossible for the communists. Gramsci chooses to return to Rome despite persecutions and spends a few months with his family. His wife was pregnant with their second child, Giuliano, but the worsening situation made her leave Italy just before giving birth. While his sister was leaving with Gramsci's other child to Moscow, Gramsci, on the other hand, decided to stay in Rome, devoted to his mission, without seeing his first child again and without meeting the second. He therefore devotes himself to reflection and writing and begins to shape what will be one of his most famous essays, titled The Southern Question. In this essay, he proposes a major revision to Italian political development, and he seeks to find the keys that allow the peasantry to converge in an alliance with the proletarian class. A few months after this essay, Mussolini suffers from an assassination attempt and is devoted to definitively dissolving the parties and restricting freedom of the press. After this, Gramsci is arrested at his home. On November 8, 1926, passing through various prisons in the north, awaiting a trial that would be delayed until June of 1928. He then receives a sentence of 20 years in prison on charges of conspiratorial activity and incitement to civil war. He is thus transferred to the province of Bari in southern Italy. In prison, he endures mistreatment, humiliations, and health setbacks. From 1929, he begins to put on paper hundreds of reflections that will later become his famous prison notebooks, later organized and obtained by his sister-in-law Tatiana Schutt. This was his greatest intellectual effort, where deliberations on literature, history, philosophy, art, politics, the Renaissance, Italian reunification, capitalism, intellectuals, and the bourgeoisie sprouted. Many of these reflections and ideas on the phenomenon of power are not only studied to this day, but also implemented by a variety of groups around the world. In total, his magnum opus amounts to 2,000 pages compiled in 32 notebooks, which were worked on over the course of 6 years, until his health prevents him from continuing. In the so-called prison notebooks, his most powerful theoretical propositions are found, which earned him his future worldwide renown. So it's worth us stopping to consider some of his ideas about the phenomenon of power, especially the one that's most developed, the concept of hegemony. Much has been said about the cultural hegemony proposed by Gramsci, but it must be clarified that he never concretely defined this term. He wrote quite a bit about it, but in a diluted way and with little continuity. However, when he most clearly exposes his notion of hegemony is when addressing the role of culture for political power systems in Europe, describing some institutions that are transmitters of culture in a society like the school, the church, the military service, the newspapers, the cinema, and the novels. And how? Do these institutions have a predominant role in the conquest, maintenance, or loss of power? These cultural institutions help to forge a certain conception of the world in people's minds, always in accordance with the ideology of the ruling class that controls said institutions. For Gramsci, bourgeois and capitalist dominance was based above all on this cultural hegemony, and not only on their control of the state's repressive apparatus. As the totalizing and universalizing hegemony manages to unify an entire social bloc, even though it is full of contradictions. Therefore, it is very difficult to undermine the dominance of the bourgeoisie, even through the revolutionary vanguard, affirming culture as the main formative axis of the revolutionary subject. Gramsci makes the communists eventually overcome their rigid economistic vision. From then on, make the revolution. It wouldn't be about taking the Winter Palace, but controlling the cultural means with which men explain the world. Similarly, the state would transition from a political apparatus to a civil one that includes culture and ideas, and traditions, and that ultimately organizes social consensus. And this view of the role of culture in systems and the struggle for power would not be assumed only by Marxists, but by power groups of the most diverse nature in search or maintenance of power. It revitalizes Marxism and other currents, after proposing that the revolution did not have to be carried out by violent means, as Lenin claimed, but through culture, aiming for the long term and with more conclusive effects, thus assuming the two possible ways to seize power through force and persuasion, or better said, with the strength of the lion and the cunning of the fox. From the point of view of political activism, an important point of impact also in Gramsci's thought, he makes an important distinction between spontaneity and conscious direction. Contrasting with theorists like Walter Benjamin, a heterodox Marxist just like our thinker, Benjamin believed that every revolutionary element flashed spontaneously, a sort of historical shock to the consciousness of the people with an almost messianic quality. But does this view of the spontaneous nature of revolutions differ from the revolutionary vision in Gramsci? For him, revolutionary pedagogy was a decisive factor prior to the moment of the assault on power, the propagandistic and cultural task that intellectuals must undertake, the conscious direction of the revolution. Based on this, for Gramsci, from the framework of thought, philosophy, praxis, the necessary spaces to understand and apply a concrete practice. On the political, it is summarized in what he called relations of forces. The forces would be degrees or moments distributed in the following spaces. The external politics referred to the hegemonic international system, the socio-economic sphere referred to the structure and superstructure, the internal politics referred to the internal hegemony, and the immediate military forces, whose elements encompass the technical military and the political military. Each of these spaces and degrees interrelate with each other in the structure and the superstructure. Economic forces influence the international political framework. This international framework is hegemonic and in turn influences the internal politics of each country, its parties, its culture, and its military forces. The hegemony among states is sustained by the economic power of the states. In this line of thought, according to Gramsci, what is understood as ideology can be characterized as the consensus among political and social actors about the superiority of an economic group. And this has implications not only in the economic and social spheres, but also in the intellectual and moral ones. This superior group is what is known from political theory as the ruling class. Under this view, the common sense or collective consciousness of a society will bend to the interests of the hegemonic group through its ideological and cultural influence. These are just some of the most basic but most important ideas of Gramsci about power and political struggle. There are many more writings from our protagonists that are worth studying, and we hope to continue transmitting in other videos, so returning to the life of our character. The truth is that Gramsci's philosophical and reflective temperament is not affected by prison conditions. What did affect him physically were the terrible sanitary conditions, coupled with his own health deficiencies. In those years, he suffers from hypertension, arteriosclerosis, hemorrhages, and Pott's disease, which is a form of tuberculosis. He goes through the infirmary of other prisons and even several hospitals until he arrives at the town of Formia, south of Rome, where he receives parole in 1934 as a result of his poor condition. But his condition only continues to worsen, and he has to be transferred to a clinic appropriately in Rome to recover. Finally, after pardons and amnesties motivated by his health, Gramsci is fully released in April of 1937, but it was already too late. His condition was terminal, and he could only live for a few more days until he passed away on the 27th of April, 1937, due to a cerebral hemorrhage. He was cremated the next day by one of his brothers and his sister-in-law, Tatiana, and his ashes were transferred to a cemetery in Rome. He died at 46 years old without seeing the start of the Second World War or the end of fascism. But he left behind a constellation of ideas in his notebooks that still hold their significance today. In short, Gramsci's trajectory represented an overcoming of the abyss that usually separates theorization from concrete action, and it was key to breathe new life not only into the mechanistic Marxism that prevailed in his time, but also into the future of the study and struggle for power, opening a Pandora's box from which important philosophical developments emerged. All amidst convulsions and obstacles that he overcame, Thanks to his great capacity for analysis and his intellectual obstinacy, which made him cling to his ideas, even in the gloom and confinement. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you liked it, and don't forget that it is very important for us that you can subscribe to the channel, leave your comments, share the video. Follow us on our Instagram account called The New Encyclopedia. And above all, collaborate with us on our Patreon with any help you can give us. Thank you very much to everyone, and may God bless you.